His Promised Land, Chapter 8. My first experience with the Runaways was in 1845 in Cincinnati, where I was working at my trade as an iron molder. I was in contract with the Free Colored Men, so I knew of Levi Coffin, the Quaker, who was active and resourceful. There are said to have been 22 fugitives hid away in his house at one time. One or two incidents might be of interest here to show you how resourceful Levi Coffin was in his meeting difficult situations. It was at the time when he had so many fugitives he could not handle them in an ordinary way. A liveryman was aroused out of his bed one night by a stranger who wanted to hire a hearse and carriages. It was arranged that the mourners were to be picked up at a certain place outside of the city. All night long and part of the next day the carriages were with drawn curtains followed the hearse until they reached Middletown, where the mourners all disappeared. Only rumor connected Levi Coffin with the affair, as the stranger paid the liveryman with no evidence as to whom he was. The use of double-bottomed wagons was a common method for getting fugitives out of the city, covered with hay or garden truck. The old-time huckster wagons, with their curtains drawn down, carried loads other than tin pans and kettles. I narrate these methods in use in thickly settled communities to indicate how the runaways silently and secretly found their way to Toledo, Sandusky, Cleveland, or Ashtabula, which were the 4 posts where known steamers could take them across Lake Erie to Canada. My first real experience with the runaways was in a manner unsought by me. In fact, I was unwillingly forced into it. I'd met a freeman who was a barber in the house where I was living. He told me that he had lived in Maysville, Kentucky, and was under suspicion of having helped runaways. He was given one night to be gone, so he took the first packet to Cincinnati, leaving his wife to pack up their belongings. The man confided in me that several nights before he was forced to get out of town, he met 2 girls in the act of running away. Knowing that they had a good home and a kindly mistress, besides being young, he persuaded the girls to go back home and stay there. Now that he had been treated so brutally, he had made up his mind to run the girls away. As proposed, I accompany him back to Maysville to aid in the enterprise. Being happy and contented, I refused to have anything to do with his proposition. The matter was dropped so far as I knew when the barber told me one evening that he had gotten word to the girls and he was going after them, again asking me to accompany him, and again I refused. But he kept after me so persistently I promised to go with him. His plan was to go to a Ohio upriver town called Ripley, of which I had never even heard. This town, he said, was 10 miles below Maysville. We would make our headquarters there instead of Maysville, where he was known. His plan was to follow up the river after night and steal a skiff, while I went into Maysville to get the girls. On the face of it, it was a quite foolish thing for me to even try to do, but he assured me he would land me below another freeman's house, so all I had to do was to climb the bank and make known my mission, and the freeman would take the word to the girls. We landed easy enough, and he gave me such an accurate description of the freeman's house, I felt I could find it. So we started out quite sure of our game, little thinking where our simple little affair would lead us. I found Ripley an active town with a settlement of freemen on the side hill across the creek. There we picked up a colored man who knew the country, who agreed to go along with us until we found our skiff. That was as far as he could go. The 3 of us walked up as far as Logan's Gap, which was on the Ohio side about 5 miles below Maysville. There we went to the riverbank to find our skiff. We searched the shore until we came to the lights of Maysville without finding a boat. There were plenty of boats, but they were padlocked so securely and their oars gone, so we were not able to use them. So back into the settlement we went, where we hid during the day. All the next night we searched fruitlessly for a boat. We did find one, which apparently had been drawn up carelessly on the shore. When we got it into the water, it leaked like a sieve. Again, we turned back to Ripley to hide away. My barber friend, being discouraged, told me that unless we could find a boat, this, the third night, he was going back to Cincinnati. We examined the shore carefully, but not a boat was to be had. It would have been an easy matter to break a padlock, but lacking oars, we were no better off than we were before. On our way back, we found a desirable boat with no oars. I agreed to search the yard of a house on the top of the bank, but a loud barking dog put an end to my hopes in that house. It had been raining most of the night, so when we got back to Ripley, my barber friend was not only exhausted, but firmly set in his mind he was through. Having set my face towards a goal, I was determined to make another try at it, even if I had to go alone. In spite of my pleading and ridiculing him, my associate did take the boat back to Cincinnati, leaving me alone. Fortunately, in our excursions up the river, he located the house of the freeman, which was in a settlement of his own color. So I had no fear, but I could handle that end of the affair by myself. I decided to boldly go direct to Maysville, thence to the Freeman's settlement, working directly from there. I had little trouble in finding my man, but he absolutely refused to have anything to do with the enterprise and advised me to leave. It was only after I had given his friend's name and the names of the two girls, and my story of how I had been inveigled into the enterprise, that he would even listen to me. Then all he would agree to do was to show me where I could get a boat, where the oars were hid. I could do the rest myself. He did agree to have the girls down to the boat at a certain hour that night. With that, I had to be content. At the appointed hour, I was in the boat waiting. Shortly afterwards, two figures came stealthily down the bank. One was short and the other tall, but both were unusually fat. When the girls came to me, I understood what gave them their unusual size. They had not only their mistress's tilter hoops. One had on 4 dresses, the other confessed to 3 and much underwear. What to do with these 2 stuffed figures was a problem, for when I tried to put both of them in the stern where they belonged, they filled the boat to running over with hoop skirts. I finally arranged the matter by placing one at each end of the boat. In addition to this extra clothing, each had brought a bundle almost as large as herself, filled with trinkets and satin slippers and other trunk down to a frying pan with which they proposed to fry their bacon on the road. Any other time I would have laughed, but serious work and dangerous work to me was at hand. I refused to carry the plunder and was about to throw it into the river when the two got up such a cry I had to push off and leave it on the bank. Even then they were broken-hearted over leaving their loot behind, and were even surly to me on their loss. There was no time to lose, and I had to row 10 miles and get the girls out of sight before daylight. I rowed to the Ohio side, where I was more or less familiar, owing to my 3 nightly excursions along that shore. Just before I reached Logan's Gap, a low pass through the high hills, I heard the rhythmical beat of oars back of us. Then I knew the bundles left behind had told their deadly story. My only safety was ashore. I made the girls take off their extra clothing and throw them in the bottom of the boat. The girl in the bow became entangled in her hoop skirts and fell overboard with a yell that echoed in the hills. When I stopped to fish the girl out of the river, I lost one of my oars, so I had to paddle ashore. We had shipped so much water in the rescue, the girls were compelled to use their mistress's fine bonnets to bail out the water. As it reached the shore, the girl in the bow leaped out, upsetting the boat, throwing me into the river. I let the skiff float off as I scrambled ashore. By this time, we could hear the frantic efforts of our pursuers distinctly, though I could not see them. At this point, while the bank was low, it was very steep. The tall girl clambered up the bank without much trouble, but the short one could not make it. She started to scream, but I slapped my hand up in a hurry. Between the tall girl pulling and my pushing, we got the girl up the bank, hoop skirts and all. There was a cornfield across the bottoms, reaching to the foot of the hills. Through that cornfield, the tall girl with her hoop skirts drawn up about as high as her head went like a scared rabbit. But the short girl was in trouble again. Losing sight of us, she began to scream again. This time I shut her up by telling her if she opened her mouth again, I would leave her to shift for herself. I then made her take off all of her dresses except one. Reduced of her load, she was able to keep up with me. When we reached the hills, we heard our pursuers yelling, so I felt they had discovered our boat, which, fortunately for us, the current had carried downstream. I had carried the dresses I had made the short girl take off. At the same time, I knew there was a swath through the cornfield as big as a bull elephant could make. Clinging to a well-traveled road, I made the girls follow this until daylight began to break. I knew we could not make Ripley, so I turned back, carefully concealing our trail where we left the road. I climbed halfway up the hill and hid in a clump of bushes. Overcome by the excitement of the chase, I fell asleep. In the middle of the afternoon, a man whom I afterwards knew as Ben Sidwell, was calling his hogs. I was so sure we would be discovered, I drew a large knife, determined to kill him. Fortunately for both of us, he went up the hill hallooing for his hogs. Shortly after dark, we arrived at the colored settlement on the side of the hill overlooking Ripley. The man I wanted was awake. He told me there was a terrible row in town over our escape, and the Theodore Collins place, which was just over the top of the hill, was being watched, that officers had searched the colored settlement and were on watch for us. He would not leave his house and our company, but told me to take the girls and hide under the 3rd Street Bridge across from Red Oak Creek and wait until later, when he would take a chance of guiding us to a friend. It must have been midnight when he came whistling down the road. Stopping on the bridge, after making sure he was not being followed, he called to me. Then it was that he pointed out the light on top of the hill, where he said we would find friends. He whistled aloud while we followed through the streets of the town. For some reason of his own, our guide took us right through the town, down 3rd Street to Mulberry, down Mulberry to the Collins house. He walked in without knocking. We were right on his heels. To my surprise, there was a light lit. Tapping on a bedroom door, Eli Collins came out. Taking us into the kitchen, he had the girls prepare a good meal. The last I ever saw or heard of the 2 girls was when they were following Eli Collins down a black alleyway. He told me afterward that he took them to the house of Reverend James Gilliland at Red Oak Chapel. That was my forcible introduction to Ripley and the Underground Railroad.